Okay. So a warm welcome, everybody, to what I know is going to be a fabulous day of discussion and creativity and a kind of bit of mind shifting as we bring wonderful Lynley Edmeades to be with us here in Dundee, who's come, I want to say, Lynley, all the way from Otago in the South Island of New Zealand, but in fact you've just hopped across the sea from Belfast. Lynley's with us to talk about her own practice as a poet, as an academic, as a scholar, as a critic, as an essayist, but also as a publisher. And we're going to be investigating her practice through paper that she's going to be reading, through discussions that we're going to have. Here comes Loretta. It's so nice to have so many of you here from past courses and those who are involved in creative practice around Scotland. Lynley's also going to be taking part in a creative workshop that we're going to be delivering later. And all together, our day here, that Graeme Morton and I put together with Gail Lowe, Graeme is Professor of Scottish Studies here at Dundee, is to remind ourselves of the beautiful links that exist between these two countries, New Zealand and Scotland. And I think at a time when New Zealand as a country is finding quite rightly its own place in the world, this day might also be regarded, if not a corrective, but a reminder of the fact that there are deep and intricate and important and complicatedly wonderful cultural links that exist between the two. So, Graeme, just a few words from you about those kinds of relationships that have always existed between the two countries.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. So, as Kirsty said, I'm the historian in the room. I work in Scottish Studies. My links with Otago go back really since when over a decade ago now, and I used to hold the chair of Scottish Studies in Canada, in Guelph. And one of our great links was with Otago as another one of the Scottish Studies centres around the world. And so we always, sort of from Guelph and here now I'm back in Dundee, I've looked to maintain those links between Scots around the world, particular links through migration, through diaspora. And there's lots of wonderful links between Scotland and New Zealand. My students are taking a Scottish diaspora module, and one of the favourite topics, of course, is the number of Scots who went, particularly from the Vogel scheme off to New Zealand, where there was a special funding. Imagine a scheme that offered you and invited immigrants in that not only paid their passage but guaranteed them a job. I'm not sure that's a political statement or not, but imagine that kind of level of support. But there's lots of wonderful links. Former colleague at the Stout Centre in Wellington, Brad Patterson, he did some wonderful links on Scottish Maori interchanges at Highland Games, for example, just bringing the two cultures together. So there's lots of ways that Scotland and New Zealand have maintained that kind of heritage, as well as part of the kind of family link. If you look at Scots in New Zealand, there was always a higher proportion of Scots in New Zealand than Scots to English at home. So a disproportionate number of Scots in New Zealand society right through the 19th and into the 20th century. So there's strong links there. And most of New Zealanders actually then ended up in the Scottish rugby team. Our famous commentator Bill McLaren used to say, "And the big New Zealander has scored for Scotland." It always confused me as a student of national. But there you go. So those links are always there, and it's great to see the historical links also developing in cultural links. And I think I have to bring in the weather as well. My last bit of research was looking at why Scots left Scotland to go elsewhere. And believe it or not, I argued it was the weather. Yes, Scots left because it's never sunny here. But they got lots of information about where the best climate was around the world. Some parts of the southern states of America. Okay, a bit stormy, there's elements of infection you're likely to get. What about Canada? Very hot summers, bloody cold in the winter. Not so sure about that. Australia, Scottish skin, too white, can't cope. But New Zealand was the answer. Amongst all the guidebooks of the 19th century, New Zealand was the best place to go, the best climate, the most salubrious climate. So we're jealous. That's all I can say. And I think we're jealous to have you here. So we're delighted to have you here. I hope that today's discussion will do justice to that wonderful link that we've had. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Graeme. Gosh, it's true. And here we are on a contested Midsummer's Day, but it is. We're in the middle of our summer, and Lynley's come to us from out of the middle of her winter. Lynley, I wonder if you might begin our morning's discussion by giving us a sense of your own academic practice, and you work in a place that we were just talking about as we walked here, is so like Scotland. Dunedin is Scottish, is New Zealand's Scottish city. And if you'd like to talk about your relationship with that city, that part of the world, and the university there.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you everyone. It's lovely to be here, and I hope to get to know all of you throughout the day. Hopefully you can understand my accent. Okay? If you can't, I'll get Kirsty to translate. So I live in Dunedin, which is Edinburgh of the south, essentially. But I think it's probably more like Dundee, in that it's a university city. It's smaller, much smaller than Edinburgh, and obviously doesn't have the historical roots. We have these funny jokes about there'll be a sign saying historic bridge, and it'll point to a sign that's about 100 years old. Point to a bridge that's 100 years old. So that's history in New Zealand, which is kind of interesting in itself. The man-made history, I would say. But I went to Dunedin when I first left home. I grew up in the central North Island in a very small rural town. And then I finished my degree, went overseas, came back when younger, as most New Zealanders want to do. And I've been back in Dunedin now for 10 years. I did my PhD there, and now I have a permanent job after years of contract adjunct teaching, which many of you will be familiar with. And my background is both creative and critical. So while I was doing my PhD, which was just a critical PhD, there were creative critical PhDs at the time, but I felt like my work couldn't quite fit into that framework, and it was quite new in New Zealand at the time as well, so I didn't feel that comfortable. I didn't feel capable, actually. So I just did a critical PhD, and then I wrote poems at the same time. I also spent a year at Queen's in Belfast doing a master's prior to that. So my first book, As the Verb Tenses, was essentially my creative portfolio from that year of doing the master's at Queen's. So then I went back to New Zealand, did more studying, etc., and then have continued to write and teach and practice, edit, keep a child, various other transformative things like that. So as a New Zealander, I guess I could speak a bit about that. It was interesting to hear you speaking, Graeme, that New Zealand was a place to go. And for me, growing up in New Zealand, I couldn't wait to get out there. It was like growing up, and I think Mick Jagger called it the arsehole of the world. That was actually invocative, which is very much the bottom of the word. Yeah. But I like to think of New Zealand itself as the arsehole of the world. And you know, Kirsty, too, the provincialism, the parochialism, growing up in the 80s in New Zealand, in a small New Zealand town. I didn't understand what a border was because I'd never crossed a border before. I couldn't wait to get out of there. So to be back there now and to be happily back there is interesting. And of course the world feels smaller. Coming to this side of the world, it feels so familiar. And yet it is so far away. And it took me 2 days to get here on the plane. But also my parents are, my heritage is English and Scottish. So my mother always talks about being Scottish. I'm like, no, I'm not Scottish. That was over 100 years ago. You can't keep claiming that. But that's part of our identity, and it's only been in my lifetime that we've actually developed what we would call now a New Zealand identity. And that's reflected, I think, largely in the writing that's coming out of New Zealand. A sense that we have a way of speaking or a way of seeing the world that is idiosyncratic to New Zealanders. And I guess I was a product of that generation that was always looking outward, always thinking, get me out of here, especially growing up in a small town as well. So having come to this side of the world, I spent a long time in London, and then quite a lot of time in Ireland, and then going back to New Zealand and editing, particularly reading lots of New Zealand writers and trying to understand what it means to be a New Zealand writer now. And I think the gaze is much more positive, if you like. The reach is still broad, but there can be, and I think this is probably happening everywhere in the world, there can be a kind of new nationalism that's kind of in the air, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. A parochialism that continues to kind of rear its head occasionally, which is why trips like this are so enlivening for us. I'm not sure what it means to be a New Zealand writer, in as much as I think we need to write back to the world still, and we need to be part. For me personally, I need to feel like I'm part of a bigger conversation. Otherwise, it gets a little bit sticky.
And that was the manifesto laid down by Land Falls founder editor, which we'll get on to talking about later when Gail has a session with Lynley about publishing and arts magazine writing and publishing. But for now, yes, thank you. And to be reminded that we're here today, I guess, to imagine, as Graeme was saying, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of a bridge between the two places, because whether one is looking outward or walking across that bridge and back from that other place as a point of return, this is to be involved in something that's very creative and intellectually stimulating, and, as Lynley says, reminds us that taking up these nationalist positions of isolation, of difference, sometimes for difference's sake, is not always productive to that kind of creativity and intellectual sophistication and plasticity. So yeah, I love the idea that all through the day we're going to keep imagining this idea of the bridge between the two places. The Indian writer Amit Chaudhuri calls this a corridor. He talks about this when he's writing about his relationship with Britain, principally in England and Oxford, and Calcutta, that he imagines it to be this corridor, which is a place of constant back and forthing. And that, in fact, the more one traverses the corridor, the shorter the corridor becomes. What did you say at the beginning, Graeme, when we were having coffee? You made a joke about...
I was in New Zealand at the centre of the world. New Zealand is not far away, we're far away.
We're far away.
And when I used to teach this topic, I used a map with New Zealand at the heart. Mm-hmm. So rather than these British imperial maps that always have Britain and then all the pink bits, Britain at the middle, put New Zealand in the middle. And that's part of New Zealand nationalism, that map is available to you. So just make that point about, what is an island, what's peripheral.
Yeah, I love that. I love all of this kind of thinking. We're going to have loads of that today. Gail and I have been in our own creative practice, kind of banging on about our new happy metaphor, which is palimpsest. We did this in Stirling when we were with you at that lovely conference of Annie Tinley's, Graeme. But this idea of palimpsest being a way of thinking about a kind of writing that reaches into two places at once. So when I was thinking a little about the creative exercise that we're going to do later, I was imagining this palimpsest thing working. So we have, if you like, an imagined map of the northern part of Britain, which we know is Scotland. So this map might start around Edinburgh border somewhere. We've got that map, and then we've got another map, which is the southern island of New Zealand, and we're putting both these maps on top of each other, so that we can see both contours and outlines through each other. We're going to imagine all the time through our deliberations today that these two places are somehow, weirdly, the same.
This is going to be a bit of a hybrid talk/reading, and it's named after the book manuscript that I'm currently, hopefully, in the final stages of working on. It's called Hiding Places, which kind of ties in with some of the things that we've been talking about. It's a very funny book, and I can't really tell you what it is, what genre it falls into. It's informed by my background as poet and essayist, alongside my academic scholarship. And I'm really interested, and lots of you would be too, in the crossroads between that creative critical the space actually of the essay, which I think is where those two things can collide, almost like two rivers